quick programme for you today. I'll outline it in a second, but just to remind you of a couple of housekeeping rules. If you put your mobile phone into silent, that would be very much appreciated. By all means, text and tweet about the event if you like forms, but if you could have the phone in silent, it would be good. If the fire alarm were to go off, we will be exiting via the lateral mark exit and the door at the back, assemble inside in the court. I'd like to thank BHA and Conway Hall Society for helping us to put this event on. And the event is as follows. So, we have our first speaker, Francesca, at the moment from 11 to 12:10. At 12:10 there will be a lunch break for 1 hour. There's a really good cafe outside on the green, which I highly recommend. You're not obliged to go there, it's very good. Then we'll be starting promptly at 1:10 to 2:40. It will be Keith Ward and myself discussing the existence of God. And then finally, all three of us will be involved in the plenary session from 2:50 to 3:30 p.m. We'll be off at 3:30 sharp. Okay, so that's the outline of the day. I would now like you to please welcome a very special guest who's come all the way from Exeter today to speak to you. She's Professor, I had to write this down, Professor of Hebrew, Bible and Ancient Religion at the University of Exeter. Please welcome Professor Francesca Stavrakopoulou.
I was sitting on the train this morning and I was just kind of looking over the sorts of things I thought I would talk about today. And the title that I gave originally for this little session was, I think it's called something like The Real Religions of the Bible. And I was sitting on the train and I thought, you know what, I really should have called this the Uncensored Bible. So if you have a delicate disposition, it's going to be fun. Generally, my interest in sort of all things uncensored is that I suppose it's a part of me that likes to go against the grain. I've always been seen as a bit of a maverick by people, but because I'm an atheist and because of, I've always been an atheist, and the way in which I've come to do what I do in my career. I did a degree in theology at Oxford as an undergraduate, and then I stayed on and specialised in biblical studies, and everywhere I went, people are always kind of really surprised that I'm an atheist and yet I'm interested in religion and I study the Bible. But I'm hoping that the Bible that I'll be talking to you about today might be quite different from the sorts of Bibles that we tend to get promoted and thrown at us in various different contexts. So to start, I thought I'd begin with a letter. I get quite a lot of letters and emails and tweets and things in the post. Some of them are really, really nice, and some of them are quite strange. But this is one of my favourite letters. I got this a couple of months ago. And it starts with this. Oh, who's talking? I'll carry on. So the letter began like this. Dear Professor Francesca, no one ever addresses me as Professor Francesca Stavrakopoulou because everyone's so scared of my surname. So Francesca's fine. Dear Professor Francesca, I saw you on the TV and you hold yourself to be an expert on the Holy Bible, capital letters. I suspect you know little of it. I can show you the things they never taught you, but I suspect, like most, you'll be too arrogant to listen. I apologise if I'm incorrect. That made me laugh. I apologise then. I apologise if I'm incorrect, but I've noticed all so-called experts know very little about the Holy Bible and refuse to even listen to anyone who may. For example, did you know that the book of Zechariah describes a nuclear weapon? This is quite tame for quite a lot of stuff I know. And did you know that the book of Daniel says that God will send the internet to destroy the world? There are encoded dates in the Holy Book, and those dates are now. The end of the world is close, and the signs given in the Holy Book are happening now, capital letters. However, most people will perish as a result of pride, just as you will. If you know to discuss it, I believe you can learn if you're prepared to open your mind. Yours sincerely, etc. So I quite like that lesson because it seems to me like the the writer, it was a man that was writing, and he was obviously kind of torn between, in part, wanting to help me and to kind of save my soul from perishing. And on the other hand, he was absolutely furious that I was having anything to say or to do with the Bible. And you often find this very strange dynamic about, well, whose Bible is it? Who has the authority to speak about the Bible? The Bible belongs to the Jewish faith and to the Christian faith. Atheists and scholars should have nothing to do with it. Well, I think that's ridiculous. I think I'm perfectly well equipped to talk about the Bible. And what I find particularly interesting is when I do talk about the Bible on TV or on Twitter or whatever, I tend to get letters like this, and they always seem to say the same thing. They say, you don't understand what the Bible says. I know what the Bible says, you don't understand. But Bibles don't talk. Bibles don't actually say anything. What they do is they have text, and it's the readers of text that say something about the Bible. So in other words, texts don't speak, we interpret them. Whether we're secular or atheist or religious, Bibles don't talk. It's us who interpret these texts. And what we tend to do is project our own cultural assumptions. So just as this guy was assuming all sorts of apocalyptic scenarios in his head about nuclear weapons and the destructive power of the internet, so to even me as a reader, I know I need to be aware that I might project my own cultural assumptions, my own kind of Western baggage onto the texts that I'm reading. And I first noticed this when I was at university. So 18, I left school, went to university, and I did a theology degree. I was really into theology. I wasn't religious. I just thought, this is really interesting. And it's theology and this very Western theological understanding of the world that's shaped and dominated so much of Western culture today, whether it's the way we view our bodies or the place of women in society, how we view certain sorts of sexuality, whatever it is, Western theological constructs have very definitely shaped this. So I was like, yeah, I want to do theology. I want to find out a lot more why the world is the way it is. Obviously, I was surrounded by quite a lot of Christians at university. I had lots of people, tutors, telling me I was Christian. I just didn't know it yet. And then people often pay me quite a nice compliment. They say, but you're very spiritual, even though you're an atheist. What does that mean? Just because I'm nice to animals and I'm a vegetarian? I don't know. But I also had a lot of people who were very unsettled by the fact that I was studying the Bible. A lot of my sort of fellow students would say, well, why are you interested in the Bible? Why would you bother studying it? Which again, is a ridiculous question. The Bible is the most influential collection of texts that we have in Western culture. It would be ridiculous not to want to get to know them better and to study them better. So we're sitting in tutorials, and I noticed that a lot of my fellow students were sort of skirting around some of the more difficult parts of the Bible, some of the more uncomfortable bits, some of the more theologically dubious bits. They were quite often sort of glossing over certain passages, ignoring others. They were okay to talk about, the well-known things like, divine genocide and, the ban on gay sex and, the secondary status of women. Fine to talk about that. But some of the other bits, the bits that were perhaps a little bit problematic, a little bit uncomfortable in the way that God was being portrayed in the Bible, both in the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, and in the New Testament. I found that they were kind of skirting around it. And I realised that what they were doing is that they were censoring their own Bible. They were not wanting to engage in particular ways with some of the key texts that are quite tricky, quite troublesome for those of a religious disposition. What they were doing was that I think what they were doing was engaging with this idea that we still have in the West, and even those who might claim they're not religious, even those who sort of say, yeah, I don't believe in the Bible, but it does enshrine a basic set of moral codes that we do identify as being British values or Western values. Even those people, they're presenting a certain kind of idealised view of the God of the Bible, a very sanitised view of the God of the Bible. And for me, it didn't make any sense. Why would you want to skirt over all the bits where God is basically being a bit of a bastard? And this matters, this kind of thing really matters, because we can't just be like a pick and mix, selective in our readings of the Bible. I know that's what quite a lot of religious people do, but we need to be able to engage these texts within their ancient social, cultural context in order to better understand who is this God and how this God emerged. And that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in the uncensored Bible. So the Bible that isn't skipped over, that isn't kind of glossed or kind of smoothed into kind of a more theologically pleasing or appetising form for Christian and Jewish readers. So what I needed to do, I realised, was that I had to recognise that I've got my own cultural baggage, I've got my own Western cultural perspective that I bring to the Bible when I read it. So what I'm really keen to do in all my work is ask what happens when we step away from our own cultural context when we read text? What happens when we read without that baggage of Western cultural privilege and preference? And the first thing you notice is that religion is nothing to do with belief at all. It's nothing to do with what you believe. Religion is about what you do. This distinction that we have in the idea that religion is somehow belief and that everything else that goes along with it, rituals and practices, is somehow secondary. Within the world of the Bible and the world that the biblical writers themselves are in, that's complete bollocks. Rubbish. Silly. Because religion is not what you believe or think, it's what you do. In the ancient world, there wasn't this very sharp distinction, as we tend to have it in the West, between the mind as a kind of a cognitive thinking, sort of seat of intellectual learning, and the body as this kind of secondary sort of shell in which we all, the mind or the soul or the spirit dwells. That's a very Western dichotomy that's really problematic. And when we impose that onto biblical texts, we're missing so much of the richness and the texture of these ancient communities that are producing these texts. Because really, religion isn't about belief at all. Religion is about what you do. Even in the Hebrew Bible, there's no such word for believe. You don't say, I believe in Yahweh. What it is, you say, I fear the Lord, I fear Yahweh. And to fear isn't an emotional response. To fear is to act out worship. It's the same word. It means I worship, I act out, I participate. I engage in the materiality of the world around me to indicate my allegiance, if you like, to this deity. So religion is not about belief in the Bible. Religion is about action and practice, what you do. And in some ways you can see this in the Ten Commandments. If you think about the Ten Commandments, there are two versions of the Ten Commandments. There's one in the book of Exodus, there's one in the book of Deuteronomy. They slightly differ. But in the main, the kind of main force of each of the commandments is the same. And in those commandments, you've got what looks to be a kind of a multi-dimensional expression of the relationship between God and his people. So on one hand, you've got the first few commandments, which are all about how you need to engage with God. So it's kind of going, what's that? That's vertical, isn't it? It's going up on a vertical sort of axis. So it's, you shall remember your God who brought you up out of Egypt. You shall not have any other gods before me. You shall not have any cult images before me. So it's all about what you should do in relationship to God. And then the second half of the Ten Commandments, from the horizontal axis, if you like, it's all about what people should do with each other. Don't commit adultery, do not murder, do not steal, do not covet, your neighbour's wife and his donkey, because obviously they're like exactly the same. But in essence, what those Ten Commandments are doing, I think they really show the importance of the materiality of being in the world. Even the command to remember, you must remember Yahweh who brought you up out of Egypt. Again, remembering within this ancient context isn't a cognitive facility. It's not a cognitive process. It's about action. And remembering, you remember by things like having sacred meals, performing certain rituals. Remembering is a bodily activity, not a mental activity. That distinction between the mind and the body just doesn't exist for the biblical writers or the societies in which they were located. So something like the Ten Commandments can also reveal to us quite a lot about, what kinds of things are the biblical writers talking about when they're talking about religion. So the very fact they're saying do not commit adultery, do not murder, kind of suggests that, some people were committing adultery and some people were murdering, human nature. So at the same time, the command do not worship other gods and do not have cult statues suggests that people were worshipping other gods alongside Yahweh, that they did in fact use cult statues as well. So already, even in the Ten Commandments, you're getting the beginnings of the real religions of the Bible. You're getting a first insight into what's really going on in terms of the social and material practice of religion in the ancient world. So if we really focus on the materiality, I think one of the things that we tend to ignore is this big bit, it's like a massive rucksack on our back that we have to kind of like struggle to get off. And that's the notion of our Western distinction between, as I said, the mind and the body. There's like this dualistic nature of human beings by which we've got a mind or a soul that's simply encased in, enshelled in the material fleshy body. Somehow that the body is secondary and that in essence we are, as a person, it's our what's in our minds that matters, not in our bodies. Again, I completely disagree, and actually I think you can I think it's very clear that even in our own Western society, we might think that we privilege the mind and the brain and the intellect above bodily ways of being in the world. But actually, when you scratch the surface, you realise that we're not so comfortable with that dichotomy either, even in the modern West. But one of the reasons why this Western idea has really taken off is with the emergence of both Protestantism and its sort of denial of what we find in Catholic and Orthodox Christianities in the West. So its denial of the materiality of the divine in things like the Eucharist, for example. So Protestant intellectual ideas in the Enlightenment and shortly after the Enlightenment were very important as a means of trying to elevate the status of the intellect and the spirit over and against the notion of the body and actions and practice and materiality. And this massive sort of, this big Western preference, this very much Protestant-derived preference, has a major role to play in biblical scholarship, because what I found when I was at university was, it wasn't just that a lot of my students were basically saying to me, oh, you know, you must be a Christian, and oh, you're going to hell, did you know that? That's fine. Honestly, I don't know. But what I found a lot of my tutors were doing, a lot of the scholars I was reading, they were similarly adopting, even without sort of necessarily making it explicit, this very Protestant bias, this very anti-material bias when it came to talking about ancient religion. And much of that derives from an anti-Semitic bent within biblical scholarship itself. So some of the earliest biblical scholars of the biblical scholarship age, so sort of from the 18th to 19th century onwards, were talking about the history of religion, and they were presenting Christianity as being superseding everything that had come before it, including and especially Judaism. So they caricature Judaism as a religion of superstitious ritual, animal sacrifice, you know, tying funny bits on their bodies, you know, cutting off bits of their penises. They felt this was a very sort of primitive, superstitious way of expressing a relationship with Yahweh. Christianity, on the other hand, these Protestants, was very much about the spiritually enlightened. It was the intellectually enlightened. So they almost rendered the intellect theological in what they wanted to do. And so a movement away from the material and emphasising instead the spiritual was seen to be particularly privileged, I think. So all of this kind of baggage that we carry as Western readers of the text is there. We might not know it's there, but we have it, a preference for the written word. These ancient texts, the people that are worshipping lots of other gods, the people that are worshipping cult statues, it renders those religions inherently social, and it also renders their gods inherently social. So by that I mean, God's pretty, have you ever noticed that God's pretty lonely in the book of Genesis? So you kind of got the idea that, I'm totally going off on a tangent here, but you have the idea that kind of God makes the world, he's on his own, no other gods, it's just me, no other gods, no one else made this at all. You know, he's so kind of, you know, he does protest so much that you think, yeah, right, of course, do it by yourself, I know. But then he gets point, so he's made the world, brilliant, made Adam and Eve, brilliant. Cain and Abel, that was a slight mistake, never mind, carry on. Then he has the sons of God, he sort of generates these sons, so these are other gods. So that whole claim to monotheism looks a little bit dodgy at this time. Who have sex with human women, and God's not really keen on that. So sends the flood. Okay, fine. So you kind of get all the way through the book of Genesis. After the flood, certain sort of families come about, and anyway, towards the middle of Genesis, Abraham. And then from there on in, it's all about Abraham and his descendants. But God's really, really lonely. This very monotheistic, solitary deity, he's kind of casting about. He says, Abraham. Abraham's what? Abraham, will you be my friend? Will you be my friend? He is this very lonely deity, because that's one of the big problems, I think, of this very monotheistic system, is that it renders God quite lonely. The real religions of the Bible, the polytheistic religions of the Bible, are all about the sociality of the gods. And ancient Israelite religion and early Judaism, and I would argue some forms of early Christianity, were much more polytheistic than they were monotheistic. In other words, they worship more than one deity. And this renders the gods themselves much more social and much more engaged with the material world. Just as we need our bodies to engage with each other, I'm talking to you now with my voice, but also with my hands and my eyes and everything else. So too, it was very similar to ancient deities. Bodies and material being in the world. Religion was much more social. So religion was very polytheistic. That's the real religion of the Bible. It was a polytheistic system. There was a kind of a high god, who in the Bible is Yahweh, and later known as just God in the New Testament, or God the Father in the New Testament. And this deity had various other gods and goddesses around him. And interestingly, gender wasn't so much of an issue as we might think it was within the heavenly realm. Gender wasn't a binary as it is in the West. Gender was much, much more fluid. So you could have goddesses that were basically quite masculine. You could have gods who were basically quite feminine. You could have kind of mixed body gods that had, all sorts of different body parts and were able to do all sorts of things. You could have male gods with penises and no wombs, but becoming pregnant and giving birth. You had gods that masturbated the world into being. I mean, they were capable of all sorts of things. Again, this is the real religions of the Bible, which I find quite exciting. But one of the deities that we know was worshipped in ancient Israel at the time of the biblical writings was the goddess Asherah. Now, she was basically the wife of the God of the Bible. And people say, oh yeah, this is just, what does wife mean? They say, what does wife mean? Because Yahweh, the God of the Bible, he wasn't a God with a body. He didn't have a penis. He wasn't sexually active. Or yes, he was. His wife Asherah played a role in which she had a very important place in this kind of divine council, or divine sort of pantheon. She was the mother of all the other gods, just as the high god Yahweh, or El, as he was also known, was the father. Other gods would come to her. She would act as an intermediary, sort of petitioning her husband for various favours. But she was also, in some ways, she kind of modelled this a wisdom, a kind of divine knowledge that was only attainable by certain sorts of means. So she wasn't just, people have an idea that goddesses were all about sex, fertility, it's all boobs and bums and vaginas. It wasn't like that at all. Essentially, this goddess represented the very being of wisdom and blessings, this kind of way of creation in the world. So there was quite a high theology, if you like, that was associated with her in her role as a consort. And both Yahweh and Asherah were probably represented in material form, even in the Jerusalem temple. There are various texts in the Bible that talk about this image of Asherah that needs to be taken away. And some people have said it was like a sacred tree. The tree is sort of like a tree of life sort of image, the idea of a fruiting tree that's very fertile, but it also gives protection. The tree is also an important, more than a symbol, it's an important index of what it is to be living in the world. The idea in the ancient world was that the universe was a tripartite structure. So at the very top in the skies you had the heavens, where like the big sky gods dwelt. In the middle was the earthly realm, where human beings dwelt. And underneath was the netherworld, or the underworld, where the dead went. Where, whoever you were, good or bad, everybody went into the underworld. And you continued to live a kind of a post-mortem existence. So things like trees were really important indices, if you like, of this kind of the harmony of the universe, with their roots down in the underworld, their bodies passing up through the earthly realm, and then their branches reaching up into the heavenly world. They basically crossed over all of those boundaries between the heavenly, the earthly, and the netherworldly realms. So they were really potent symbols of power and of an ability to hold the whole universe together. And Asherah, some scholars think, was very much symbolised by this notion of this tree of life. But she could also be represented in human form or in anthropomorphic form, as Yahweh probably was. So a lot of people are always surprised, like, but you're not allowed to have images in the Bible. No, you're not allowed to have cult statues. Of course Yahweh was represented by a cult statue. We've got various inscriptions. The Neo-Assyrians, basically they kicked off in the ancient Near East, beginning towards the end of the 9th century, but well into the 8th century, and they destroyed all sorts of various local powers, including Israelite cities, including the city of Samaria. And the king boasts that when he set up a big inscription, sort of boasting about what he did, it's a bit like, never mind. I'm not going to go there. I'm going to get political, I won't go there. I do this, you must stop, it's too much coffee. So the king sets up this big inscription and basically says, I'm amazing, I've destroyed all these people. And when he talks about destroying Samaria, he said, I've taken however many hundreds captive, I've taken their chariots and put them into my own army, and he said, and I carried off the gods in whom they trusted from their temples. And some people think that alongside this inscription, we need to read a series of frescoes, basically, kind of wall reliefs in stone, that show, they're lovely actually, they show Assyrian soldiers with their kind of conical headgear carrying off on these kind of stretchers, these little deities, these models of deities. You know, some of them are kind of like this, with like weapons and helmets, some are like that, some are sitting on thrones with like nice goblets. These are the ancient gods and goddesses of the city of Samaria. One of those statues is probably Yahweh. So we know that Yahweh was represented in a material form, and quite often in anthropomorphic form. Even when you read things like in the book of Isaiah, a very famous passage in Isaiah, Isaiah 6, when Isaiah goes in his temple and he's like, whoa, I can see Yahweh sitting on the throne, oh my God, it's amazing. And what he sees is a human figure. He's sitting, he's got a voice, he's got hands, he's got perhaps one reading of the text. When you read the English translations, it normally says, and the hem of his robe was so big it filled the temple. The Hebrew probably means the tip of his penis was so big that it could fill the temple. But we can come back to God's penis later. So Yahweh and Asherah were very much materialised in the cult place. So I'm not using the word cult there in a derogatory sense, I'm saying cult as in what we do, actions, religious actions and practices in particular spaces. But did they actually have sex? Let's get down to the nitty-gritty. Was there a sense of divine sex in the Bible? Well, some scholars say not, some say no, Yahweh is not sexual at all. Yes, he might have a penis, but he doesn't use it. They have a very limited view of sexual activity in my experience, but never mind. There are some texts that might indicate that Yahweh was sexually active. So we don't hear about him having sex or trying to have sex with the goddess Asherah, unlike his kind of alter ego in Canaanite text, El, who's always trying to have sex with his wife. But she never quite, she never, so she's, oh, I'm busy. But Yahweh does in some places seem to be sexually active. So one example is in the book of Hosea. He's talking about how he's going to bring about this fantastic fertility, this period of fertility. He's going to bring this amazing rain to fertilise the land. He talks about Jezreel, which is a very sacred, mythologically a very charged area in the Hebrew Bible. And he basically, the Hebrew basically has him, it's essentially talking about ejaculating into the fields of Jezreel. I will know you, this is the sexual language of sexual intercourse. I will know the fields of Jezreel and I will render you fertile. As I said, we might have a glimpse of Yahweh's penis in, this is going on yesterday. We might have a glimpse of Yahweh's penis in Isaiah 6. In Ezekiel chapter 1, the prophet sees this kind of amazing fiery vision of Yahweh with his mobile throne. So it's basically a throne with wheels and wings to commune about. And he sort of says, he talks about something incredibly sort of fiery and hot and exciting, but where the loins are. So, there's some kind of sexual charge going on here. But then Yahweh doesn't just have one wife. In the biblical text, he also has lots of wives. One wife might be Eve. When you read the story of Adam and Eve in Genesis, a very strange thing happens in the text. First, she's called the mother of all living. That is a goddess title. It's a title that's given to Asherah in some of these texts, so, in the goddess texts. But then something very strange happens because Adam and Eve, they've been made, and Adam's very pleased, having kind of gone through this. So Yahweh makes all these he thinks, I'm going to make a partner. I'm going to make a partner for Adam. He's really lonely. I don't want him to be like me. I want him to have a partner. So what does God do? He makes loads of animals, as if he's trying to get to what is woman? No, and Adam's like, no. And then finally, woman, finally, at the very end of the day, when God's absolutely knackered, it's like, oh, here, what about this? It's like, oh, yeah, that'll do, great. But there's a very peculiar part in the text when Adam and Eve come together, and then all of a sudden, in the narrative, both Eve and Yahweh kind of disappear from the story for a bit. It's almost like they kind of step out of the scene. And then the next minute, she's back saying, I've got a child off of the Lord. And the language there is very loaded. It implies that it's Yahweh that's impregnated Eve, not Adam. I don't know what Adam's doing. He's probably tilling, talking to the snake, doing something. But it implies very much there's something underneath the surface of this tradition. There's something there that might suggest that Eve had some kind of sexual encounter, perhaps, with Yahweh. But the strongest evidence for Yahweh's other wives and his sexual activity we find in the book of Ezekiel. Now, Ezekiel's a great text because Ezekiel, within certain early Jewish traditions and certain rabbinic traditions, Ezekiel was seen to be so racy that only men over the age of 30 could read it. The main chapters that are so problematic are chapters 16 and 23, for those of you that like to make a note of these things. Now, in these stories, Ezekiel is basically furious with Israel, and he's kind of telling the story of Israel. What's happened in the past? Why have we got to this point? Why is God so angry with us? Why has he thrown us out of our land and away from our people? And Yahweh says, I'll bloody tell you why. And he basically describes meeting Israel. He sort of personifies Israel as a woman, but he personifies her as a baby. And he says, you were nothing. You were kind of, you were an outcast. You had been born from these foreigners, these foreign parents. They didn't want you. They cast you out. And I walked by you and I saw you flailing about in your own blood. This is the blood of postpartum. So this is postpartum blood, so after childbirth. He says, I saw you, I picked you up, I washed you, I anointed you as you would the babies. And basically, you have a story in which God basically grooms this child. He says, I waited until the pubic hair sprouted, until your breast sprouted, and then I made you my wife. To make a woman somebody's wife is essentially to have sex with them. She has a twin sister. In one version of the story, it's just Israel is just one woman. In another version of the story, it's Jerusalem and Samaria take the role of these wives. So he has sex with her, and then he says, I gave you everything. I gave you jewels, I anointed you, and he basically presents her as a goddess. She's dressed as a goddess, she has various rituals performed for her. But what a slag, says Yahweh, because she goes off whoring after other men, after other gods, essentially. She's even so desperate for this illicit, adulterous sex that she pays her customers for sex. So rather than a prostitute who takes money, God says, you even paid these foreigners to have sex with you. There's all sorts of interesting details about sort of a very orientalising tone of the text in which Egyptians have members like stallions and semen emissions like donkeys. I mean, this is a God who's clearly got some issues and anxiety about his relationship and his sexual behaviour. But what's particularly striking about this is the negative portrayal of divine sexuality in these texts. Sex is seen as something that's feminine, that's very deviant, that's basically it uses a shorthand for religious malpractice, so kind of sexual infidelity is used as a kind of conceptual metaphor for religious malpractice. But what's also particularly hard to read, and I think for a lot of women theologians is very hard to read, is what God does to his wife next. So rather than just shouting her and saying, this is the way you behave sexually, he then arranges for her to be gang raped by all her lovers, and then he beats her, and he mutilates her body, her face and her genitalia. And the sort of psychological trauma of this is so intense that she ends up also self-harming, which is a way to read the text. So it's a very discomforting, very, very unsettling view of God in the Hebrew Bible, and yet it's right here. And what's problematic about it isn't the sexuality, it's the violence. That's what's more difficult in some ways, because in other texts, the Hebrew Bible is very comfortable with sexuality. The Song of Songs is a really good example of the very positive imaging of the female body, female sexuality, and heterosexual sex. It's very explicit as well. But it's a very, very positive imaging. Similarly, the story of Ruth, who turns out to be she's an ancestor of Jesus. She meets her husband, she's trying to seduce him, and so she performs a sexual act on Boaz in a ritual setting at the threshing floor in the dead of night. He's been at a religious festival, he's in the sacred space, the threshing floor, he's drunk, tired, and she creeps up to him in the middle of the night and she uncovers his feet. A very well-known euphemism for genitalia. I might just point out at this stage that feet as a euphemism for genitalia isn't so common in the New Testament, in case you're getting any ideas about it. I often have to gloss that for my students. I don't know, it's not the same thing in the Greek. In the Hebrew, yeah, in the Greek, no. But there's a very positive sort of image of sexuality being something that can occur within a religious space, a religious context. The Song of Songs is in the Bible, not because it's some kind of metaphor for a marriage between Jesus and the church. It's because it's a celebration of this erotic kind of love poetry. This was a part of the real religions of the biblical world, the eroticism and the ritualized eroticism of what it was to be a material, bodied human being. So in some ways, Yahweh's sexuality isn't the problem for the real religions of the Bible. It doesn't matter that he's got a willy. It doesn't matter whether he uses it or not. What really matters, I think, for the biblical writers is the way that they then incorporate violence, this kind of divine violence, into Yahweh's sexuality. Now, if you want to gloss over that, I'm kind of happy with that. I don't particularly like reading about violence against women, obviously. But I think for some biblical theologians and biblical scholars, they don't even look at the sexual side at all. They say, oh, this is a metaphor, it's just a metaphor. What is just a metaphor? Everything is just a metaphor to a certain extent. But I think if you really engage with the materiality of the worlds in which the Bible emerged, it's this kind of really, this very fleshy, sort of multi-sensory portrayal of God and of the other deities and the other beings within these religious contexts that I think really comes across to us. That's what I mean by an uncensored Bible. But there are positive forms of body modification. So I talked a little bit about Yahweh being so brutal to his wives in a bodily way, but there are very positive forms of body modification. Circumcision. Yay! God was probably circumcised. Because there is this idea in the Bible that men, because obviously it has to be men, the penis ones, that they are to be like God, and they're to circumcise themselves. Now we don't know whether circumcision was, and I apologise if anyone's a bit squeamish, we don't really know if circumcision was about the complete removal of the foreskin, or only it being sort of slit or cut in places. But regardless, circumcision was a really important body modification practice. And it was important because what it did was it rendered the body fit for purpose, for religious purposes, as well as for sexual purposes. For religious purposes, it rendered the god suitable for the view of Yahweh. You can't go into Yahweh's sanctuary if you're uncircumcised. Obviously, if you're a woman, you can't go in at all. But you can't go into Yahweh's sanctuary if you're uncircumcised. And circumcision isn't just a mark of the covenant, as it's sometimes described. What circumcision probably does is that it renders the penis more fruitful. So the same word, circumcise, is used to talk about harvesting fruit trees. So when the fruit tree is growing, if you want to have a bigger yield of fruit, you lop different bits off it. And so you circumcise the fruit tree in order to render it more fruitful. Similarly, you circumcise the male penis to make it more fruitful so you can have more children. So there are some forms of body modification that are not just very positive, but completely tied up in the way that being a material, social being is what makes you religious. You have to render your body, if you're a man, fit for God by rendering yourself fit for sexual activity. Which I kind of like that idea. I mean, I haven't got a penis, so, maybe I wouldn't like the idea of circumcision so much. But I like the idea that here we've got an ancient religion that's very comfortable with the human body in ways that maybe later on Judaism and Christianity aren't quite so comfortable with the reality of the human body. And it wasn't just the living body that was so powerful, the dead body was incredibly powerful too. So when we're reading about the kind of the way, this view of the world, the idea of the heavenly world above, the earthly realm in the middle, and then the underworld, the netherworld beneath, this wasn't a bad place. There was no such thing as hell. This is a much later invention, a nasty invention, that demonises, literally, the dead and renders them other. So once you get the idea that somehow the righteous are going to go up to heaven to be with God, then necessarily you have to have the kind of vilification of the underworld. But in the period when most of these biblical texts were written, including the time of Jesus, this wasn't a bad place, the underworld. It wasn't a bad place at all. It's where everybody went, good or bad. It wasn't a place of judgment. And what most people believe is that the dead continue to live once they were buried in their tombs. So being buried was a mortuary practice that basically transferred you as a social being from a once living person in the community to a once living, now dead ancestor in the underworld. And the maintenance of your burial place, the maintenance of your bones, was incredibly important. If you only existed for as long as you remembered. And as I said, remembering wasn't about cognitive action, cognitive being. It was about performing certain actions. So to remember your ancestors, to remember your dead, you had to go and perform certain rituals. And the Bible's full of this kind of stuff. People going to the tombs, performing bone rituals. They would lay your body out. fresh corpse, all laid out, nice and neat, and then go back and perform certain anointing rituals. We see this kind of thing in the gospel stories about the women going to the tomb of Jesus and discovering it's empty. They go there because they're going to perform rituals. All this stuff about, oh, corpses are dirty. Most ancient Jewish people didn't believe that corpses were dirty or a contaminant. This is a much more specialised, very priestly understanding. There was basically regulations for only priests that later became applied to lots of people. So the women going to the tomb is not an extraordinary thing at all. So, once the body's decayed, which is like kind of the best bit, for various reasons, but it's a really exciting bit. Once the body's decayed and the bones are left, you then kind of gather up the bones, perform certain sorts of rituals with the bones, and then you inter them, maybe in an ostomy, a bone box, or in a little hole in the floor of the tomb where the bones of your other ancestors are. And you are literally mingled with the bones of your ancestors. You are literally gathered to your death. That's an expression that's used a lot in the Bible, to be gathered to the death. So these bones were incredibly powerful. Some of us know the story about Elisha, the prophet Elisha, who his tomb was on the side of the road when a funeral procession was going by. And all of a sudden, some marauders, I love the word marauders, some marauders came. And the funeral party was scared, and so they threw the corpse they were carrying into Elisha's tomb. And as soon as the corpse touched the bones of Elisha, the corpse stood up and came back to life. Loads of zombies in the Bible. This is not Jesus monopoly, and everything. Loads of zombies in the Bible. So, and it wasn't just because Elisha was this divine or holy man. I mean, that's part of his kind of the cult of Elisha later on. But it's because the dead were perceived to have an essence. They now were privy to the secrets of life and death, because they're now in their second existence. They're in the underworld. And so to a certain extent, their bodies too became charged, if you like, with this power, which is exactly the same thing as we find later on in Christianity, the cults of the saints and fragments of bone and various sorts of other relics that we find all over the Mediterranean and Europe. These parts of the dead saints that have this special power. People believe that they could transfer some kind of life-giving properties. It's very similar in the period of the Bible. And so, the notion that this corpse could somehow come back to life is not really that extraordinary. Now, I'm not saying that happens every day, but what I am saying, I suppose, is that even the claims of Jesus' resurrection, this is not a unique event within the ancient world. This is not a unique event at all. It's a recycling of various different religious and mythological beliefs. The mythological belief is that lots of other gods were killed and died and rose again on the third day. And the god Baal, for example, in the Ugaritic text, exactly that happens to him. Osiris in Egypt, he's dismembered. He loses his penis and his wife makes a false penis and has sex with it to get a child, and then he comes back to life. Now that is pretty impressive. So the mythic recycling of the Jesus resurrection story, is quite interesting. But what's particularly, I think, overlooked by people when they're kind of doing their censored reading of the Bible is that the very notion of a corpse coming back to life wasn't that extraordinary. So we tend to think of Christianity as having this kind of exclusive claim to agency beyond the grave, that somehow the resurrected Jesus has the monopoly on this kind of resurrection activity. But it wasn't the case at all. It just wasn't anything out of the ordinary in terms of the particular ritual, religious and mythological landscapes in which these texts were being developed. I feel like I've talked quite a lot about penises. I suppose what I'm trying to say is that there are various aspects of the Bible that, yes, there are some very difficult bits. There are some bits that are shocking for modern readers, whether you're a believer or an atheist, whether you're a male or a female, or whatever position you come from. We're all bringing our own kind of baggage, and that baggage does weigh us down in some ways and kind of influence and interpret the way we view these texts. But I really would love to encourage people, particularly secular people, to reread the Bible, but try to do it without this censorship that we all tend to do. Try to read it for the text within their ancient context, because it ends up being, you'll see exactly what I see, that you've got this fantastic collection of ancient myths and traditions and stories that remind you just how alien these people were, just how different these societies were. And so the next time when somebody tells you that, you know, that the Bible is the moral guidebook for Western society, you know, point out God the groomer. Point out God the domestic abuser. We need to really face up to these sorts of things. And I think it's a real shame when people just dismiss the Bible as being a boring, dusty old book that's either irrelevant or some kind of spiritual manual, because it's neither of those things. I think it's amazing. And I think I might stop there because it's 11:45 and I'm a bit ashamed that I've said the word penis so much. We were very happy to do questions if anybody had anything burning to say.
Yeah, something on the quick questions. You mentioned that you could interpret the Abraham did sacrifice his son. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, I wondered about including child sacrifice in talking to you a bit today about the stuff that... Could you tell that that whole thing was basically these are the bits of the Bible I really like? I thought about including child sacrifice. I read my first book on it, and everybody knows, you know, roughly the story of Abraham, and it's Isaac in the Jewish and Christian tradition, and Ishmael in the Islamic tradition. So the idea is that this is Abraham's only and beloved son, despite the fact that he's had other kids. This is his only and beloved son, and God says you've got to sacrifice him. Abraham's like, okay, yeah, fine, no questions. Yeah, fine. So off they go. And it's quite interesting because traditionally the story has been interpreted as either from a history of religion's point of view, that this is the moment when the biblical writers are trying to say, we're not going to do that primitive, barbaric human sacrifice thing anymore, we're going to move to animal sacrifice, which is much, much better. Tell that to the sheep. But actually, I don't think that's the case at all. There's evidence of both human sacrifice, or child sacrifice, and animal sacrifice being contemporaneous within the same cultures at the same time. And what seems to be the case with the Abraham and Isaac story is that when you read the text, so what we have is what we call the Masoretic text, which is the traditional Jewish text. But we have other sorts of versions, some Greek, there's a Samaritan version, there's all sorts of other legends, that some of which have the story that actually Abraham does sacrifice Isaac. Isaac wants him to. There's some fantastic ancient Jewish version in which Abraham looks longingly at his son who's bound up on the funeral pyre and sort of says, and sort of interesting, he talks about his body being like the flanks of a sheep, and you know, he wants to cut his neck and like let the blood flow like he's a lamb. You know, it's almost like he's consumed by this want to sacrifice his son. And then he does it, and now Isaac's saying, yes, yes, you must. This is what God wants. Much like Jephthah's daughter does when her father sacrifices her in the book of Judges. And he actually goes through the sacrifice for Yahweh. No one ever talks about Jephthah's daughter, but it's the same thing that happens. It's in Judges. But when you read the Masoretic version, the version that we tend to have in our Bibles now, you think that what happens is this angel of the Lord appears, this divine messenger, and says, stop it, and there's that poor little ram that's caught up looking a bit nonplussed. But when you read through towards the end of the narrative, you notice that Abraham is said to have gone up the mountain with Isaac and a servant and a donkey, I think. But then when he comes back down the mountain, Abraham's on his own, there is no Isaac. So it looks like there's one version of the story, at least, that was going around, and we might have a trace of it even in the Bible, that Abraham actually did go ahead with the sacrifice. And child sacrifice was not a foreign practice. It's presented in the Bible as something that nasty, deviant foreigners do to a foreign god called Molech. Molech is a biblical character, it's a fiction. Really what this is referring to is a royal type of sacrifice that was offered to Yahweh. Yahweh demands that the Israelites sacrifice to him the firstborn of all their animals and their sons, their human sons, as well as the offerings of the first grain and the first harvest. Some texts, he says, you know, you can buy back your baby by making a donation to the sanctuary. Other texts don't require a buyback at all. And even the prophet Ezekiel has Yahweh say, I hated you so much that I deliberately gave you commandments that told you to sacrifice your firstborn to me so that I could horrify you. Now obviously this is Ezekiel saying God was doing it as a punishment when he commanded you to sacrifice your firstborn, but it's also Ezekiel basically saying, yeah, Israelites were sacrificing their children because they believed that Yahweh had told them to do it. Does that answer your question? That's...
So what translation would you recommend if you were to read up on this? What would you
There's a
recommend?
really good book, there's a very readable book by John Levinson called The Death and Resurrection of the Beloved Son. And he looks at a lot of the Jewish traditions, and he also looks obviously at the Christian traditions. There's a lot of the language that we find in the Gospels and particularly in Paul's letters in the New Testament is mimicking the language of sacrifice and child sacrifice in the Hebrew Bible. Oh my God, there's thousands of hands. I know there was a hand over here. Oh no, sorry, the Bible thank you.
One of the biggest inconsistencies of the Bible is the story about the creation. God created Adam and Eve, and they gave birth to 3 kids, and one of the son killed the other. So at that moment, you probably had like 3 people in the world: Adam, Eve, and their daughter, and the son that killed the other brother, he went off to another land, and for some reason, he found other people there. You know, having God creating Adam and Eve, only 2 people in the world, and then the son goes up to another part of the world, and he came up to some other people, and he found people there. How do you explain this? Theologically.
Theologically? That's even harder than how you say, how do you say this? I mean, basically, it doesn't have to make sense theologically, because I suppose what I was trying to illustrate in my talk is that sometimes what we bring to these texts isn't appropriate to bring it to these texts. So just as kind of bringing a sense of, oh, Jesus was a great, social liberator and lover of women, they kind of skirt around the fact that he calls a Canaanite woman a dog. And deliberately so, it's deliberately, he's being very offensive. They forget that he kicks off in the temple and is very violent. So equally, to bring those sorts of questions to stories about the first human beings, in a way, it's not what the Hebrew Bible writers are all about. They're not writing a history in the way that we would understand a history. So these kinds of questions to them wouldn't even be, we see them as inconsistencies or anomalies or contradictions in the text. So even in the book of Genesis, when it's talking about the flood, on the one hand you've got God saying take a pair of all the animals, 1 pair of all the animals into the ark. Then you've got take 7 pairs of clean and 1 pair of unclean into the ark. So you've got, even within just a few verses, what would seem to us to be massive contradictions. But the biblical writers wouldn't have seen it as a contradiction. For them, it wouldn't have been odd that you have Adam and Eve, and then Cain and Abel, and then suddenly all these other peoples appearing. They just wouldn't have found that strange. So, yeah, I think it's the job of a theologian rather than a biblical historian or a text critic to explain that, because it's harder for a theologian to explain it than it is for us. So we just say that's not, the biblical writers just didn't see history in that kind of linear way that we do. And they weren't writing history. They didn't have that kind of category of history, I don't think. Does that answer your question in a not very satisfying way?
Yeah, well, it does. I just wanted to get your understanding of that. I mean, how do you explain it? I just think it's a little rubbish.
I think because they're drawing on different traditions, and they just don't see I don't see a problem with it. Theologically, I wouldn't need to explain it, because for me, theologically, the notion of a monotheistic, solitary, creator deity is very poorly presented in those texts anyway. So there's a myth about the creation being the main creation myth in the Bible isn't about 6 days of creation. It's about God fighting this massive kind of great sea dragon, the sea monster. You see it in Job and the Psalms and the book of Isaiah. It's a much more common myth. And we find that myth replicated all over the ancient Near East. It's other gods doing it, whether it's Marduk or Baal fighting this great dragon. And you get a little hint of that even in Genesis 1, which is meant to be this very, a very transcendent God that creates. He creates just by speaking words rather than kind of shaping things and moulding things. And he said, let there be light, and there was light. So he's a God who creates from speaking. And yet even in that text, there's reference to God creating the great sea monsters, and the word used there is the great dragon, that is exactly the same word that's used to talk about this great mythical divine monster that all the other gods have been fighting and that Yahweh fights in other texts. Did you answer that? Because I...
Well, okay, thank you. It's just a question, obviously covered, you really answered. Sorry, okay. It's a question of,
it's a question of interpretation. You've already demonstrated, you've looked at other languages and original texts. But I wonder how much we are guided by our biblical readings and the translation of Wycliffe and others in the past, in their social circumstances as well. So their interpretation of the words that they've read may be shaped by the social mores of that particular time.
Yeah, I mean, and not just in terms of Wycliffe and various other early English translations and printings. Any translation is an interpretation. Every translation. Lectures start at Exeter next week, and teaching the first year. And one of the first things I'm going to get them to do is to do a comparison between two different English Bible translations of the same text, of this story, Genesis 6, where you've got the sons of God, which a lot of translations will say the angels, but it literally is the sons of God. It's, and they're divine beings. They're, they're deities, they're kind of secondary deities, who have sex with human women. And associated with this sexual behaviour is the emergence of these mythical people called the Nephilim, which in some other texts, the Nephilim are these gigantic figures. So I get them to compare two English translations from different, I think one NRSV and one somewhere else. And even just looking at the punctuation, the capitalisation, the way in which the translator has decided to present these words has a massive impact. So for example, at one point Yahweh says in this story, "My spirit will not abide in them." And in one translation, spirit has a capital S, which if you're reading, you would think, oh, spirit, like Holy Spirit, right? Like the Christian idea of the Holy Spirit. So it's, this idea of it being some kind of an essence, divine essence. Other translations will render it soul, other translations will render it person, because the Hebrew itself is nephesh, which basically means, my being, my who I am, or my heart, or some such. And so every translation is an interpretation. And that's the same, it just has to be a religious text. It's the same with most other things. If you're rendering something from one language into another, it's not just a matter of finding word equivalences. It's about understanding the tone and the cultural context of the original piece of writing. And that's massively difficult particularly when it came to the translation of the Bible into English for the first time. Certain translations were being privileged over others, because of textual manuscripts, because of the power of the Western Church over against the Orthodox Church. That's why we've got why the Old Testament within the Protestant tradition is different from the Old Testament in the Catholic tradition, and different again from the Old Testament in the Orthodox tradition, because various different Christian groups throughout the medieval, the medieval period, had a different sort of preference for different sorts of collections. So yeah, never trust a translation. I don't know who to ask. Hi.
So I want to get your opinion on the I wanted to get your opinion on the skeptics who are Jesus Methodists, and what your opinion is, and what the consensus between atheist biblical scholars is.
About Jesus?
About the mythicism of Jesus.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Sometimes I meet people who are really excited to find that I'm a Bible scholar and an atheist, and then they're really disappointed when they say, oh, Jesus is all made up, isn't it? And I say, well, obviously, most of it is made up, as far as I'm concerned. But I don't think, so some people argue, there's a certain group of sort of pseudo-scholars that argue that basically what came first, Jesus the myth or Jesus the man, essentially. So whereas some scholars say Jesus the man was a historical person who actually existed, and that various sorts of mythic tropes have become attached to him and to his movement. Others would say it was the Jesus myth that began first, and that it was basically backfilled with historical details or pseudo-historical details. I mean, personally, I think that there was probably some Jewish guy who was a popular leader, and by popular I don't necessarily mean unofficial. I think he probably had the backing of some wealthy supporters. Some people even suggest that Mary Magdalene, we tend to think of Mary Magdalene as being this, a woman about his age, but it sounds like, if you take some of the details from the Gospels as gospel, which I don't necessarily, but some scholars do, some of the details that you get about her, it seems that she's a single woman. Why the hell is she single? That's, because she's a prostitute. She's not a prostitute in the Bible in that way. Some people say she's widowed. So is she a lot older? Is she a very wealthy woman? She seems to have, a business. So it may be that he has some quite wealthy sponsors. And basically, I think he was of a type of divine specialist, a ritual specialist, and there were loads of them running around at the time. There always have been. And so I think he probably existed. I think it's probable that he was executed by the Romans, but that's a political execution. That's nothing to do with religion. I don't think the Jewish authorities had anything to do with that whatsoever. And I think he was regarded as he was like a John the Baptist figure. Just as John was executed, so Jesus was executed. This happens. You only have to look, in today's world, we know that this kind of thing happens. So no, I don't think that the whole notion of Jesus of Nazareth is like a backfill to a mythic idea, but I do think that, obviously I don't think that Jesus resurrected. Obviously I don't think he was born in a stable or anything like that. I just think that he was very popular for a very short while. He was executed, bitterly disappointing for his followers. But then so many others were as well. And lots of people were doing what he was doing. Homey the circle drawer, he's my favourite. He kind of drew circles and stood in them. I like that.
I often wonder how much your photos have thrown light on the amount of travel that was taking place between civilizations. We often think that, for example, the Hebrews, the Egyptians, the Babylonians were separate civilizations, but I suspect a great deal of borrowing was taking place in those mythical times before the Greeks began to write history. How much your studies have thrown light on the amount of travel in the ancient world, in the Bronze Age?
Oh, there's so much, and not just, late Bronze in particular, but Middle Bronze Age too, in the part of the world that tends to be called the Middle East now. And in the period of time I study, it's sort of ancient West Asia and the Eastern Mediterranean. A huge amount of trade and travel, and I think none of these cultures were isolated, sort of monolithic societies. We know even now that's not how society works, and that's not how society would have worked in Northern Europe. In the same period, in the late Bronze and the Iron Ages. So why would it be any different in the Eastern Mediterranean and the ancient West Asia? So we know there are all sorts of there's massive amounts of trade. We've got correspondence from different sorts of city-states all over Mesopotamia and going down into Egypt and into what's now the Arabian Peninsula. Luxury goods, the production of luxury goods, things like little amulets and even certain sorts of architectural styles. Are spread all over the place, particularly Egyptianizing, because Egypt was such a major force for so long in this whole region until it began slowly to collapse. And then, the Assyrian Empire and the Babylonian Empire come about. So, yeah, there's absolutely masses of information. And there does seem to be a relationship, not necessarily direct, but there's a relationship between the emergence of statehood and the production of luxury goods and that kind of economic connection between territories and places, and the increased production of certain sorts of literary genres. So not just tax receipts and shopping lists, which you find all over the place, but the writing down of some of these great epics and the composition of certain forms of wisdom poetry and that kind of thing. So yeah, it was an incredibly cosmopolitan part of the world for a very long time.
Just one point. I obviously am familiar with the Arabic language, and a little bit with Hebrew. The two seem to be very close. What does that suggest? Did the Hebrews actually originate in Western Arabia rather than in ancient Judaism, Judea?
Arabic and Hebrew, modern Hebrew more so, but Arabic and Hebrew are cognate languages, but they are quite similar. They're not so similar. They're not as similar as, for example, ancient Hebrew and Phoenician or Moabite. But yeah, they are very similar. But they all broadly come from the same family of languages. Much like there are links between French and Spanish and Italian, they're cognate languages as well. But yeah, in terms of the origins of the ancient Israelites, where do they come from? The Bible has two sorts of foundation myths. The first foundation myth of the people is that they descend from Abraham, who comes from Mesopotamia and is told to leave Mesopotamia and to come to the Promised Land, the land of Canaan. And the second foundation myth is the Exodus myth, whereby they begin life as slaves in Egypt and they come out of Egypt and they come to Canaan. Those two foundation myths have been brought together and put into kind of a narrative, whereby you've got the patriarchs, Abraham and Isaac and everyone coming first, and then Moses and the Exodus. But I think originally they were probably separate myths that have been joined together. Archaeologically, the notion that these people began outside the land of Canaan can't be supported. It would seem that the Israelites were one of a number of smaller populations within the indigenous Canaanite community. So archaeologically, it's very difficult to tell the difference in the late Bronze, early Iron Age between a Canaanite and an Israelite. So I think they emerged from within the land. Just as lots of different groups, so they were no different than their kind of Canaanite neighbours. They were just a subset of the broader Canaanite population. Oh gosh, I don't want to keep you running around. And there's a question over there, back, if I do the great teacher.
My 14-year-old daughter was quite interested in coming along today, but she decided she needed a lie-in. And as much as I enjoyed your talk, and as liberal a father as I think I am, I have to sound quite relieved. But speaking seriously, like you, she's the only vegetarian atheist in her GCSE religious studies class. And like you, she's having a lot of dilemmas and discussions with other children. And even though the curriculum's changing, it's still very hard to be a vegetarian atheist and learn about religious studies. In education, I mean, you're obviously at the top and you can talk to your students about these issues. Is that sort of filtering back down to secondary education, or is it something that when you go to university you sort of say, okay, you've learned this now, basically forget it and start again? Or can anything be done? Is there any sort of possibility to get sort of modern teaching back into liberal ideas and critical ideas back into RS, because notwithstanding what the syllabus is, it's still extremely conservative at all.
God, talk about asking a big question. I suppose there's two things I'd say in response. The first is that I know that there are some problems in the teaching of religious studies in some schools, but equally I know that there are some very good religious studies teachers and programmes that go on in schools. So I do think it's a very mixed package. And the reason it's mixed kind of gives me a little bit of concern as well, because we notice it. Obviously, a lot of students that come and do degrees with us have done religious studies at A level or equivalent, and some of them haven't even looked at anything like the Bible at all. It tends to be sort of philosophy, religion, and ethics. Questions about euthanasia and abortion and that kind of thing, and the existence of God. So when they are encountering some of these things, I know it can be really, really patchy. So that's why I really do think it's important that I and other academics do events like this, because I want people to understand that it's good for my discipline. I want people to know that you don't have to be a Bible basher to be interested in the Bible, and actually that it's really, really interesting, and that religion can be explored. You don't have to buy into a lot of the stuff that some religious people want you to buy into. So that's why I do this kind of thing. I would encourage them definitely just to watch lots of stuff on YouTube and to come to events like this and to meet as many different sorts of people as possible. But I do think, I think with any university, any academic discipline at university, it's a massive shock for students, because we spend most of the first year deconstructing anything and everything that they might have done before, not just in religious studies, but in terms of the way they approach history, the way they approach language. You have to kind of deconstruct all of that and then sort of help them to reconstruct it. So it's like independent learning, and you're teaching them to become critical thinkers. Whereas perhaps at school, we're not so good at teaching them to be critical, independent thinkers as in the way that we want to work. That's not teachers' fault, that's the government. They're getting started. How are we doing time? Sure.
So, would you please
Thanks.